Hello, my name is Victoria O'Malley, and I'm presenting on the topic of the history and future of innovation within continuing education. For this presentation, I'll first describe what I mean when I refer to continuing education, then I'll dive into an overview of the literature and any trends that emerged. The key themes will be reviewed along with top takeaways, and I'll conclude with some ideas for future research. First, let's assess the meaning of continuing education, as there are many definitions out there related to professional development, sometimes offered through associations or companies. I adopted the definition of continuing education being the mode of education offered to adult learners through a higher education institution. So think of continuing education units or colleges that typically serve adult learners. I wanted to provide a brief overview of the continuing education timeline to give you a sense of how far back the concept extends, but also to illuminate some of the key moments in its history. A form of continuing education goes back to antiquity, when communities would gather to discuss life and learn from one another. Then we fast forward to the Industrial Revolution and see a newfound mission to educate adults to meet industry needs and support social progress. As we know, the Morrill Act of 1862 really changed the trajectory of higher education in America, and it had an impact on continuing education as well. By the 19th century, the Chautauqua movement emerged, in which year-round lectures were delivered to adults, and that led to the formation of a more formal university extension. The University of Chicago was actually the first to formalize a continuing education unit. In the 20th century, there was a rapid professionalization of the workforce, and continuing education was leveraged to help educate that workforce. We also saw the GI Bill, which of course offered funding to veterans of World War II, and was one of the first national policies to encourage adult education. By the 1990s, distance education was becoming increasingly popular to help provide access to education to busy adults, so we saw the rise of online education. In recent years, the economic downturn of 2008 caused an influx of adult learners coming back to school to retool their skills and be more competitive in the marketplace. Let's turn now to the purpose of continuing education. Throughout its history, continuing education has been used to stimulate local economies by educating the workforce to meet the needs of employers. This, of course, helps professionals secure better futures for themselves by offering access to education in formats that are more convenient for adults. And lastly, when we look to continuing education units residing under that umbrella of larger institutions, there's a clear purpose established for these units to generate revenue for the university. Higher education is becoming more market-driven, and given its history, continuing education has typically been leveraged as a university's avenue to meet consumer demands. Considering non-traditional learners are taking over as the majority of students today, there is a need for continuing education to lead the way in providing access and helping other units shift their models. There's also a rise in competition when it comes to continuing education providers, so it's important to understand those options. And on a personal note, I currently work for a continuing education unit and find this area of education really compelling since it provides access and continues to be fairly innovative when it comes to higher education. Turning now to the literature, as I started my research for the annotated bibliography, I discovered several journals that were dedicated to the topic of continuing education. Here you see several listed of the peer-reviewed publications that emerged in my research, and I relied heavily on these journals to learn more about the issues facing continuing education. In the literature itself, I found that several articles focused on qualitative research. On the negative side, there weren't many articles available that offered a historical perspective of continuing education, so when I did find those, I really latched onto them. Finally, a trend I found across the literature was just some confusion about the term of what continuing education actually meant. Jumping into the key themes, I want to start with the one theme that emerged in almost everything I read: innovation. Continuing education has a clear history of being innovative to meet the demands of the market, and this came through in everything I was reading about the historical perspective of continuing education and the future of it. Another theme from the literature was the shifting demographics in America and around the world, of course, requiring continuing education units to be more agile and appealing to these markets. As we see from the stats, 75% of undergraduates today meet the requirements of being a non-traditional learner, according to the U.S. Department of Labor. So as we see adult learners take on multiple roles, including being a student, continuing education units must find ways to provide that needed access. A lot of the innovation needed for continuing education units to thrive really comes from the top, and across the literature, continuing ed leaders are described as innovative. They have to exhibit vision, embody an entrepreneurial spirit, and be willing to take risks in order to meet the needs of the market and continue to generate revenue for the institution. As I've previously mentioned, community is a major component of continuing education, and it's used to help improve the community through education of the workforce. Being in that role of community convener, continuing education units must create community and corporate partnerships and be really invested in what employers are looking for in graduates, perhaps more so than even the traditional academic unit. So some top takeaways include the need for continuing education units to generate revenue and meet community needs. In order to meet these demands, the leaders of continuing ed units must be innovative in their approach and demonstrate an entrepreneurial spirit. And finally, practitioners working in continuing ed units must understand their shifting markets. In terms of future research, there are several areas left to explore that would be beneficial in better understanding continuing education and its role today. First of all, that inevitable turf war between continuing education providers will be really interesting to look at in the coming years as we see more and more companies and universities getting into that online space and the continuing education game. We have badges and MOOCs and boot camps all emerging, so how will that impact the demographics, the employers, the institutions? Looking at the different business and financial models of continuing education units could help shed light on what works best, particularly for those units embedded within an institution. More research should be done on the use of technology and its impact on learning, perhaps its long-term impact as well. And for me, my interest lies in branding and marketing, so I'll plan to assess how continuing education continues to innovate when it comes to their branding and their marketing and their communication in order to attract and retain students. Here you'll find my references for this presentation, and if you have any other questions, please reach out to me. Thank you.